Hey everyone. So we're going to be talking about CP, how to plan for it. Why are we going to do that? Well, because CP Nats is this weekend. Hopefully, a lot of y'all are going. I'm very excited about the tournament. And I think that in general, we end up underdeveloping how to strategize CP other than just telling people how to do CP. So yeah, that's generally what we're going to be talking about. Two things in particular. A, how to do gov. B, how to do op. I know, I'm very clever with titles. So I'm going to start off by talking about gov. Some notes, by the way, on this. First, I have a tendency to either go off on tangents or say things in really weird and sometimes dumb ways. If that has happened, throw a message in the chat. I would love it if you did that. I would happily change myself and correct myself. Two, if you have a question at any point, please throw it in the chat. It's the only way I can know that anybody is getting what I'm saying. So with that being said, let's get started. I think the first thing I wanted to talk about in regards to gov and case prepping is basically a question that every single year CP season comes around, other novices in my own club and in other clubs have asked me, which is how many cases should you be prepping to bring to a tournament? And obviously this number is variable. The minimum is probably 3 or 4 just based on the amount of times you can draw gov in a tournament through the tab system. But if you're trying to prep to like make sure that you're not dropping your govs, I would argue your number should be significantly higher than that. I remember when I did CP Nats in my second year with my partner then, we had about 9 to 12 cases prepped for the tournament. Not to the level that you would want all of your good cases prepped to, but to the level where we could just pull it out and run a PM speech if necessary. Why did we do this? One, we're both a bit psychopathic. Two, and I guess much more importantly, it's because most of CP, when done at its best, is some form of targeting other speakers and trying to play to your own strengths in comparison to known weaknesses that you know your opponent has, right? If you are going against, if you know that there are 4 teams going to a tournament where, you know, maybe you know that they are particularly weak in rounds about economics, it's in your interest to have a bunch of cases about economics ready to go in the event that you hit them, because that just means you're playing to your own strengths in comparison to them. Having just one case for such a situation doesn't allow you for a lot of flexibility later on in the tournament. So I think that there's a few things to be said though when it comes to targeting. The first is like, only really do this for teams who you actually know about. Like, I can do this for debaters who I have gone against countless times throughout the too many years that I've been debating, because I know what they are interested in and stuff like that. However, this is a fairly bad strategy if you actually are just guessing based on like an institution or one rounds that you've had against them, likely to go poorly. You know, shout out to the time where I ran a case about international soccer against a team that I thought would know nothing about international soccer, and turns out they knew significantly more than me on the subject, right? Only really do this in situations where you can be rather certain that you actually have accurately reflected on a team's strengths and weaknesses. Secondly, do this with some amount of measure. Don't just plan for like, okay, here are all the teams coming to the tournament. Here's one case for each and every one of them. That will drive you insane, because in a lot of circumstances, you may have similar strengths and weaknesses to a particular team. For example, there is a specific Hard House team who, whenever I've had to prep for CP, I've had no idea how to prep them, because the weaknesses they have are the exact same ones I have. The strengths they have, I feel, are the same ones I have a similar knowledge base on. Prepping against them is difficult. And in a lot of circumstances as well, you are going to hit teams that you have no familiarity with and no knowledge of. In those circumstances, I would say that it is in your interest to make sure that you're writing cases not only that you find interesting or that you think are fun or that you think are weighted towards Gov side, but that play to your strengths in your own knowledge base. one of the best performances that my partner and I had last year was when we showed up to a tournament with cases nothing but sports and hip hop, because those are two subject areas that we are both very passionate about and know a lot of things about. Where even when we went against teams that knew a considerable amount about those issues, we just happened to know more examples about it and could win out against a lot of teams on those issues. The reason I flag this is because I think that's where the benefit of, for example, running cases that you find fun or interesting or about your interests comes to your strength. I think that's more or less where it comes from. To be more specific here, I want to talk about how you write cases that you find interesting, but that also play to your strengths. Because I think that a lot of people make a mistake when they're building cases in CP, wherein all they do is try to build a winning PM speech, and that's about it. This is a very, very flawed strategy. The reason for this is because I find that most CP cases could not be won in the PM speech. Instead, what you're doing and what I think you ought to be doing is preparing as many strong lines that opposition could reasonably run against your case. Think of whatever motion you are interested in running. Try to identify 3 or 4 of the strongest op lines that exist to it. Be as charitable as possible. Pretend you are opping your own motion and write out the ways you would opt your own case. Run these motions in your practices against teams that you are comfortable going against. And remember how it is that they approached opping your case. Remember this, and before you write your PM speech for the umpteenth time, or like spread every single word, find the most interesting quote or statistic or something like that, after you've identified what the strongest ways on opposition are to beat your case, write out every single response you can think of to those cases. If you know that there are 4 arguments that are rather strong on opposition, try to figure out what the best way is to respond to every single one of them before you bother with the PM speech. The reason for this is because if you find that there's one argument that is particularly tricky to avoid and is particularly difficult for your side to win, maybe it's the kind of argument that your side just kind of has to concede is going to be true, and it's the kind of argument where all you have to do is try to outweigh what the other side is saying. Fundamentally, you have to then prepare your PM speech around that point. Your PM speech, once you've identified that there's one argument that you can't really refute head on that well, what your PM speech should be doing is trying to frame that argument out of the debate. It should be trying to make sure that the context that you set the debate in, the arguments that you give weight to from the beginning of the entire round, are those that try to push that round either into irrelevancy or force op to do a significant amount of weighing that they otherwise wouldn't be doing to try to make that argument as true as possible. That's how I think you have to approach this. Like, I'm going to use a dumb example here, but I think that this is indicative of the strategy as a whole. If any of you are familiar with me, and I hope to God this case dies soon, in my first year, I ran a case which was about hitting a child on live television. If any of you have heard of such a case, please forget that from your memory. But that's where this strategy came into place. This was a stupid idea, a fundamentally bad one. You should hit a cancerous child on live television. Bad idea, right? But if you're prepping that out, you can respond to arguments about whether or not your teammates will like you. You can respond to arguments about whether or not the city that you play for will like you. You can have responses about what you're able to do post-career. And we had all of those plans, right? We had responses like, look, if you win the Super Bowl, maybe the city will like you because, you know, none of the teams in the city really win all that often. So by all accounts, they'll probably like you. Maybe they'll think that this was some sort of trick that the other team was trying to play to force them to win. Maybe they're a rival of yours, so you don't really care. You can have responses about what you'll do after your career. Say, like, maybe you just won't try to do anything else. You've made millions and millions of dollars. Why should you care about a career after football, right? You can have responses to that. The thing you don't have a response for is, dude, you're a psychopath. What the hell? You're trying to hit a child on live television, right? This is an unbelievably messed up action that you're taking. So the whole PM speech is fronted around trying to frame that argument out of the debate as quickly as possible by making arguments that sound obscene about moral responsibility or being a what's it called, enemy combatant in wartime or whatever, and saying that that's true of a child. Obscene ideas, but at its core are just trying to frame the argument that you know you can't deal with out of the debate. But if you don't take this kind of approach to prepping CP cases, that of identifying which arguments you're going to have the toughest time responding to and crafting a PM speech in response to it, what ends up happening is op will stand up after your PM speech that's like rather well crafted, trying to prove two impacts in particular, and they'll just throw shit at the wall, right? They'll just be like, here's 6 arguments, none of them all that well developed, here's just how it goes. And your partner in the DPM speech is going to have a significantly tougher time responding to all of this material. Not because you've not thought through the responses. I assume that most debaters nonetheless think through responses that they can give. But because if you don't know which arguments you should just try to take the loss on and not try to spend 4 minutes of your speech proving aren't true when you can't do that, you then don't spend enough time winning the arguments that you can win in that case, right? And that means that in a lot of cases, the round just gets away from you and becomes about 1 or 2 arguments that you didn't plan for it to be about and that you didn't want it to be about. So I think realistically, the way you should be prepping these cases is thinking about the DPM speech first in a lot of circumstances and using the PM to just like kind of guide the debate in one way or another. Right? I would also say that the reason this is true is because in a lot of cases, I think that judging in CP is going to be a bit harsher towards the PM because technically you have infinite time to prep your PM speech. I feel that judges aren't going to be as chill with you just, having 2 really well prepped arguments. It's like they should, right? I'm not saying they won't. I'm just saying I feel that that's more likely than not. Ooh, there's 2 things in the chat. You don't have to. It's a long construct. I did this as a first year. Basically, some team that you're playing in the Super Bowl and it's the last play of the game wants you to smack it, like put in a kid and gave them the ball for the last play of the game. You're on the goal line. Do you hit them? It was a stupid case that I ran in my first year that unfortunately gave me a lot of CP notoriety for being a flagrant idiot. So yeah, that's why you do it. Yeah, you want to be able to try to just like force op down one particular pathway, right? Because built into this structure of CP is op is disoriented, right? They've heard the motion. They have 6 minutes to prep it. That's less than half the amount of time they would get for a BP round, right? They are fundamentally disoriented and they're looking to your own case if they are unfamiliar with the material that you're forcing them to debate for ideas of what their op case should be. So your PM speech shouldn't just be 6 arguments, all of which you're trying to prove in rapid succession like you would a normal BP speech, but instead should be trying to direct op to a particular clash point that you feel that you can win. And I think that that's one of the strengths of prepping for CP. Yeah, I haven't really exhausted all my thoughts on this, but I'm going to move on to something else because otherwise I feel like I'm going to get repetitive because I feel like I've been talking about the same thing a lot. The next thing I want to talk about when it comes to prepping on Gov is doing PMR speeches. I think that a lot of times PMR speeches do not go the way debaters would like them to. This goes for LORs, but we're going to talk about LORs when I talk about op because I have some hot takes about being on op. For starters, always take the 10-minute speech. So, PMRs. I think a lot of teams do not use PMRs to their advantage. Whether it be because people are trying to do a full whip speech in 3 or 4 minutes, something that they're not able to do, whether it be because teams are wasting time at the beginning of their speech by having like a 45-second intro, which, is about a 25% of the speech itself, those are some reasons why PMRs don't become all that helpful. It could be because teams are trying to rebuild an argument that like they've kind of already proven. I think that the main focus of PMRs really should be just identifying the biggest trade-off in the round. Or, sorry, to rephrase, what the biggest trade-off in this specific round has been about. You've just had 10 minutes of almost uninterrupted op material because people don't ask POIs and CP for some reason. You've just had 10 minutes of almost uninterrupted material. You have at most 4 minutes to respond to all of it. That is not enough time. Yeah, so instead of trying to respond to 4 new ideas that just came out of the LO speech one by one, instead your job should be frame the debate and be like, look, this was the main thing. They have 5 minutes of analysis on this policy won't work. We gave you these reasons to believe that this policy would work. The reason whether or not this policy works is the most important thing in this debate, is because that's how you get to any of the impacts anybody wants to talk about. I don't know, I've made up a motion, right? And from there, just try to win that one clash point. 3 minutes or 4 minutes is not much time to do anything else but that. If you can make it clear to the judge just the one thing that they should be voting on and try to win that one exact point, your PMRs are going to come off a lot better. And if instead of just trying to go line by line in a PMR refuting things, you're instead just characterizing the rounds and the kinds of decisions people are likely to make in the construct of the case that you've written, you're also going to see a much better job in the PM, because in a lot of cases, accurate characterization and framing gets thrown out the window in CP cases because people are just trying to grasp at straws what the debate should be about. If you can be very clear in this, you'll do well. And I would note that characterization and framing is never new material, right? Like, I'll pull up the WUDIC guidebook if anybody really wants to fight me on this point, but like characterization and framing is not new material. So you shouldn't ever really be discredited from the PMR being like, let's be clear about what this debate is about. Let's be clear about how people are going to make decisions, right? Because it all stems from arguments that have already been said in the debate and teams could have reasonably expected to be able to respond to, which is what the WUDIC guidebook suggests is the threshold that has to be met in order for something to not be considered new material. So I think fundamentally for PMRs, you should just be focusing things into one or at most 2 issues, framing, characterizing the round and the people and how they're going to make decisions, and just winning out on that one main clash point, instead of trying to do all of this like mini whip speech type of stuff that a lot of people try to do. I think I have like one more point on Gov that I want to talk about before I go into talking about OP. After I make this, we'll do a short like question thing and then I'll just move on. Cool. Last thing on Gov. Wording motions is going to help you way more than you think. I'm going to give one bad example first, and then I'll talk about this more generally afterwards. Bad example is then I had a bad time because of this, not because it's like actually unhelpful. I have this one motion that I used to run a lot that has a double negative in it. It's like this house opposes measures that try to limit. It's a double negative in it. Both times teams have been confused by what the motion was. This isn't deliberate. It's just the most comfortable way to word that motion for the arguments that I want to have in it. So I'm not suggesting have double negatives in all your motions, but what I am suggesting is like, be clear on what the burdens are of any one motion based on the wording of that motion. If you want to make a debate about like a particular narrative being bad, you should not word that as this house regrets, because this house regrets in any BP style guide says that Gov has a burden to provide a counterfactual narrative that would have likely come up in the absence of that narrative, and then has a burden to explain why that narrative would have been preferable. If all your case wants to do is dunk on a particular narrative and why it's been bad, don't word your motion as this house regrets, because an op team should call you out for not having counterfactual, and that will hurt you significantly, right? Unless you want the DPM to just be like, actually, here is the comparative, which sounds like a messy and not fun debate to get yourself into. So instead, if you just want to be like, is this thing good or bad? Like, don't be afraid to sound like potentially a little silly in how you're wording motions. Like, believes that X has done more harm than good is probably what you're looking for, and will mean that the burden that you've placed on yourself just based on the motion is completely sensible, right? Or, this house regrets, X particular type of label, suggests that you need to have a counterfactual label that you would have rather people called themselves. If instead you think that that label has been bad, just saying that you think it's done more harm than good is a potentially better way to do this, right? Because now the burden on opposition isn't to just be like, oh, but the comparative would have been worse. It's instead to force them to say that it's created active good. And you can do that a lot more with the wording of your motions. Under this as well, I would like to just emphasize, like, oh, sorry, I have another point on op. I was going to just transition here really awkwardly. Last point on gov, I swear to God. Please don't be a dick about the cases that you're trying to run on gov. What I mean by this is, let's say you have a super specky case about a country that you and your partner happen to have matter filed a lot for Worlds, but then no such motion came up about that country in your matter file. So now you're salty and would like to run a case about that country. Or, I don't know, you just happen to like a lot about X particular country, think a policy that it's doing is interesting, you want to run a debate about it. Who knows? Please do not just stand up, say the wording of the motion, and go into your specky IR or econ round. This will not go well for you at all. Not because any op team is going to stand up and be like, oh, that's spec. Spec calls almost never have been, like, in the 4 years that I've been doing this, nobody has ever lost a round because of a spec call, at least to my knowledge. Tight calls, sure. But spec calls, no, that just does not happen. What you should do, the reason this is a bad idea, though, is because what will happen is teams are going to just stand up and say that the facts that you're telling about that country aren't true. They just will. You can have a round about a country that you've prepped very, very well against a team that knows nothing about this place. But if your chair also does not know much about this place, which I'm not doubting anybody's intelligence, but if you happen to have a very specky case about, I don't know, Venezuela, and your chair might not have the same level of knowledge as you about Venezuela because it came out of you doing deliberate research that maybe they didn't do, they might just agree that you were lying because they have no reason to understand what's happening in the rounds, and chairs shouldn't be like Googling facts post-round. What you maybe should be doing at this point is like writing out info slides for other teams, stating facts that are true and that help both sides of the debate in the beginning of the PM speech, or just making your motion op choice so that way you can actually like inform the other team and the chair about issues that matter to that particular debate. That will not only make sure that the round itself is fun and interesting in the way that you had always imagined, because people are more likely to be saying true claims, but it also means that the likelihood that a team can stand up in response to like your fact about how a government's been operating in the past and be like, that's not true, are now significantly lower if a team had the ability to ask you questions about it in the case construct, or had the ability to, be told about facts that also benefit their side, or be given some sort of info slide. It just minimizes the messiness of that round and it helps you significantly more. I would talk about op choices and stuff, but like I feel that a lot of stuff about op choices and stuff have already been said. Like if you want to have a side that's the clear strong side, like look, man, you might lose if the other team picks that side. Yeah, I don't really have too much to say on op choices. Just be responsible about them and do them if you have a motion that you think is going to require a lot of questioning and a lot of clarity before the debate's able to start. Before I move on into talking about opposition, do you guys have any questions? Oh God, I didn't see the chat thing. Yeah, spec stands for like specific knowledge. Yeah, it just stands for like specific knowledge, things that like you might know way more about than other people. So like if I were to stand up and be, yeah, cool. Um, okay, James, a tight call is when a case is unoppable, or at the very least leaves opposition to have very little room in opping a case. Cases can be tight in two ways. First, on the wording of the motion itself. Secondly, on how the motion itself is run. An example of each. If you want to run "this house would legalize gay marriage" because there isn't an opposition argument against it, that is obviously tight, because the arguments that you are forcing opposition to run are either homophobic, untrue, or homophobic. Yes, I know I repeated myself. You don't really have a strong argument against doing it. You're forcing op into a very, very inaccessible, untrue case line. The bar for tight cases is more than just like forcing op to be homophobic, but that's at least a baseline that's pretty clear. Another version of this is like in terms of motions that um, are in terms of how you run the motion. So for example, a motion which is like "this house would legalize polygamy" does have opposition arguments to it. By all accounts, there are reasons to maybe not do that. But if the reason you're going to legalize polygamy and your only argument is the reason this should be legal is because it is going to happen anyway, and given that these structures in many cases have had women be abused, and as a result, if it is legal, women are more likely to be able to call the authorities and make sure that they are able to have some amount of justice and be removed from abusive situations, opposed to a comparative where they feel more afraid to call the proper authorities, that's tight as hell, because you're forcing opposition to defend, making it more difficult for women to leave abusive situations, or try to make a case that like neither side is particularly good at that. That's more likely to be tight in the way that the debate is run. If you're responding to a tight block, I guess I'll talk about tight calls and stuff a little bit here. Please don't, please, please, please do not respond to a tight call by just gesturing at a BP tournament that set it in its own final or something like that. I know that there's a debater who has gone around running a case that is questionably tight and saying, well, it was set in the final of a tournament and the world's #1 speaker this year won it from closing opposition. Cool. The WUDC top speaker could win many debates from the wrong side. That doesn't mean it's not tight, right? Please give actual substantive reasons as to why your case is debatable in that event, just because it means that you're more likely to be believed. Last point, sorry, I just remembered something on PMRs. In PMRs, please, Lord, do not just stand up and say, oh, this argument that the LO made in their second speech is really good. However, it is too late and it is unfair for them to have said it then. So we're not really going to respond. Don't do that. Don't do that. One, it's bad debating. Two, you have 4 minutes to respond to it. If it was such a good round-winning argument, respond to it, right? You can flag out that it was a bit unfair that they said it late, but you should still have a response to that argument, because if the chair doesn't think that it was too late in order to deserve credit, or the chair believes that it should be framed as rebuttal as opposed to a new argument, both of which are legitimate things to do. Also, the LO is allowed to provide new constructive materials. So like the distinction there is likely to be not as clear. Don't just flag an argument for being too late and think that that gets you out of being able to give a substantive response. Please, if you're going to call something for being too late, also like have a meaningful substantive response to that argument. On to talking about op bench. The first thing that I would like to do is I would like to preach the gospel of taking the 10-minute speech. I think that once you become a more experienced debater in CP, you should be taking the 10-minute speech. I think that the 10-minute speech is OP as hell. I think that the game devs for CP need to nerf the 10-minute speech. It is absurd that such a speech is really allowed to exist. And I think it's weird that people don't take it every single time. The reason I think that you should take the 10-minute speech every single time after you become like more experienced and confident as a speaker and feel that you have a lot of material to say is because really you can spend, okay, let me just outline the comparative. The 3-minute LOR as a rebuttal speech in most cases only serves to either further rebuild an argument that the second speaker was making or respond to one argument that your partner may have forgotten. Most LORs, however, don't often even really do that because you can't be a good summary of the round if the round just like finished having all of the responses and constructive material. Like it's just you're learning what the debate is about as your partner is speaking and have to be writing the speech throughout. It is also always going to be a 3-minute speech. It is not enough time to really, really win out on just like one clash point if your partner maybe frames the rounds in a different way or didn't respond to one particular argument. I think that in a lot of cases, the LOR just doesn't really advance anyone's case and instead just kind of serves to like get in one last point of rebuttal that might be here or there. The benefit instead of the 10-minute op speech is in your capacity to frame the round in such an aggressively op-weighted way. Think about it. You have 3 minutes in this 10-minute op speech just to do framing. You have 3 minutes in this speech to just do framing and deal with like sporadic, like outside of like the main contents of your speech arguments before you still have 7 minutes and 15 seconds to do a normal DLO speech. 3 minutes of just framing alone is so powerful for your side because you're able to just snatch the debate away from whatever context Gov wanted it to be about and force it to be about your material. Because all Gov has left is one PMR, which at most is 4 minutes and 15 seconds, which notably is only a little bit longer than the amount of time you have just to frame the round. If you can provide a counter framing to the debate, so outline a different context, a different set of actors or whatever that you think that this debate applies to, and explain why that is the most important context for that debate, you are going to do a very strong job in beating Gov Bench because their PMR is going to have to A, explain why your framing is untrue, B, explain why their framing is more important and more likely than your framing, and still beat you on a line-by-line basis for your material. That 10-minute speech allows you such power to frame the round that in a lot of cases, the PMR speech cannot respond to everything that matters to you. And after you set such a strong framing, if you just do normal rebuttal and rebuilding, but all under the framework that you set out for the beginning of your speech, those arguments that you now focused in on have significantly more weight attached to them because they're all fitting under a very well constructed framework. That is so, so strong in your ability to beat any single Gov case. Because think about it. Maybe your partner wasn't sure what the debate should be about. Not to blame your hypothetical partner here, but sometimes emotion comes up, you're not really sure, so you just kind of make up a few arguments and sit down. But if they happen to make a strong argument about, one specific actor that maybe the DPM didn't get to be able to respond to, but you can really build that actor to be very important in the debate. Now you really hurt Gov in their inability to have responded to it. You can rebuild that argument to be significantly stronger. You can weigh that argument against everything that they're doing, right? And force Gov's material to just be pushed out of the round substantively just based on one group of people that you choose to make the debate about. That is going to be very, very strong for your speech. The second thing that I would say about being in favor of the 10-minute DLO speech is that I don't know about any of y'all, but I personally have this issue as a speaker where I just kind of have a few things that a speaker said that I want to respond to, not because they really benefit my case to do it, but because I just have an interesting thought about what was said and like to say it anyway. I waste time in a normal BP debate responding to extraneous stuff. In CP, in a 10-minute speech, you can respond to extraneous material that you might not think is important, but that you might not have responded to anyway, but the chair might not have thought it was important, but still have a lot of material left. Basically, my point is with the 10-minute speech is that you have such a massive amount of time to make the debate about whatever issue you want and to respond meaningfully to every single claim that the other side makes. The way you can maximize the potential of the 10-minute speech, though, is not to structure it in like one 7-minute block where you just do a DLO speech and then a 3-minute block where you do themes. I think that that could work, but I don't think that that's the most effective way at maximizing how you can get the most out of the 10-minute speech. Instead, what I would say is just split the speech up into themes from the beginning. Right? If you make it just a 10-minute whip speech, right, you've done your job as the second speaker to summarize the debate, right, while still doing all of the framing and rebuttal and response, but not doing that weird like transition that a lot of speakers do of like, and now to respond to this argument, now onto my themes. The themes were what I said earlier in my speech and what I said later in my speech. That's often an awkward phrasing, and it means that you're often repeating yourself a bit more than you would have liked. Instead, you can use this time to just maximize the amount of material that you are putting into the round that is responsive to the other side while still filling your criterion of having been a full summary speech from the beginning. I think that 10-minute speeches are really, really powerful. And I think that if done well, can get you obscenely high speaker scores. I really, really think that they are the correct way to do it, indicated by the fact that it's the traditional BP thing, which means that I guess it was the thing that we all used to do. Anyway, that is my 8-minute rant in favor of the 10-minute speech. I was really trying to go for 10 minutes, but I couldn't. I thought it'd be funny if I had done a 10-minute rant and a 10-minute speech. Other things to do when on op. I want to talk briefly about type calling and stuff like that, because I think that's important. I think the first thing you should do whenever you hear a case, if you're first op, is think of its tight. Think of any reason you can think of for why it's tight and try to make that tight call. For those of you who are unaware, a tight call is when opposition just stands up and is like, yeah, this debate just doesn't really work for us. What I would say though is do not make a tight call every single round. That would be absurd. Don't do that. The reason you don't want to make a tight call every single round, hypothetically, if the speaker on op argues the wrong side of the motion, first op argues for the wrong side. Oh, I would just, I mean, it's unlikely op has won that debate based on the question in the chat, just because I feel that 10 minutes isn't really going to be enough. But like, personally, what I would do is discredit what the first op speaker said and weigh the material by the second op speaker. I wouldn't really care about things being too late because, I mean, I feel that Gov got the luxury of getting a speaker to not defend the correct side of the motion, that they can deal with some material being a bit late. Yeah, I would just weigh the material by the second speaker, but other judges would disagree with me here. Yeah, I would just ignore first speaker, listen to the material that was relevant and weigh that against everything Gov did. That's what I would do. So on tight calling, don't do that every round. Why? Because if you're tight calling a motion, what you are implicitly saying is that the arguments that your case contains are unimportant. What you are implicitly saying when tight calling around is, hey, yeah, this debate undebatable. We have bad arguments. This debate could not give us good arguments. So what you should do is evaluate this round based on how good we can try to make these not good arguments sound. Don't try to tight call every round. You'll also just be annoying as hell. You'll have unfun debates about if a debate is possible and not about anything substantive. So Oh my God, I need more water. I can feel my voice starting to go. Mm, what I'd say as well when it comes to tight calling is you can do this super slimy thing that can help you in a lot of cases. I'm going to lovingly call it calling a case half tight, where basically what you're doing is standing up and saying, look, we're not saying this motion is undebatable. What we are saying is this part of their motion is undebatable. We won't engage with that. Here's why that part of their motion is undebatable. Instead, if you're going to let us have this understanding of the debate, then we think that this is a perfectly fair debate, and that's the one we're willing to have. This can be a very, very, very effective strategy from opposition because you get all the benefits on op of forcing Gov into like, oh, no, it's not tight, Here's why this isn't tight. Oh my God, no, how could you think that this was tight? And you get the benefit of also framing the rounds into the most charitable way for your side possible, because you get to be like, oh, we're just not going to engage with this. Here's the part that we think is relevant. Here are some contexts in which you can do this because I realized that that's rather abstract. There was one motion in particular where I remember this was an effective strategy, but there's like plenty of other similar ones. I think it was like 2 years ago, maybe 3. God, I've been at this too long. 2 years ago, I'll say. Motion was, this house regrets the rise of the gig economy. In hindsight, I personally think the motion is a little tight. I'm not going to go into my own personal opinions right now, though. But the strategy that was significantly more effective was not to just say that the motion was tight and try to move on. The strategy that was significantly more effective was to stand up and say, hey, all this stuff about workers getting completely screwed over by their bosses, yeah, that part's undeniably true. So we're not going to make this a debate about that, because if you want it to be about that, then it's tight, because all workers get screwed over entirely by their boss. But also, it is undeniably true that Uber workers are hurt by their employer. So that's not really this debate. Instead, if you're willing to have this be a debate about how this affects, I don't know, consumer happiness and the accessibility and affordability of consumer goods, then we can have this debate. And that worked. Gov had to flounder around, try to explain why it wasn't tight when we'd still kind of done it, and it worked rather well for our side, right? You're not calling the motion explicitly tight, you're just trying to say that a specific subset of arguments don't really work as effectively as, are a bit too narrow for your side to have access to, and trying to force the debate to be about another issue that they may not have plans for as well. Yeah, so that's how I think tight calls should be working. When doing a tight call, please actually explain in depth why the motion is tight. Your tight call should effectively be an argument itself. Here is why this is a true claim that this debate is undebatable, should basically be the structure of it. Otherwise, it's very easy to disregard it. Yeah, I'm done talking about tight calls. I find them very unfun to talk about. Other things when it comes to op. In the first op speech, I think that it is in your interest to spend as much time doing constructive as possible. Do some rebuttal. Do like 2 minutes of rebuttal. Oh, if the round's actually tight, yeah, you do all the speeches and you have a very unfun debate where DPM goes, here's why this is a debatable debate. And then DLO goes, no, here's why this isn't a debatable debate. And in between all of that bickering, you have arguments that are very minor happening in between the two speeches. So it's like, here's why this is a debatable debate. Now, second argument, here's why this is a good thing to do. And op goes, here's why this isn't a debatable debate. But even if it was a debatable debate, here's why this is a bad idea. And at the end, the judge goes, well, was this a debatable debate? And then just kind of figures it out. The deliberation on this isn't decided on were arguments made. It's about like, you know, what positions did op have to take, what stances, what actors that they have to defend, all that type of stuff. Yeah. Lastly, when talking about opposition, I would say that like you should spend as much time as possible constructing arguments in the first op speech, because it's really the only time that you have to give new arguments, unless you want to try to deal with a team like complaining if your second speaker stands up and makes 2 new arguments. Spend as much time as possible constructing new arguments. And I understand that it is rather difficult for people to, think of a bunch of arguments during the 7 or 6 minutes that a speaker is speaking. One thing that I would suggest people at the very least try out is just not listening to the PM speech after they hear the motion. Just don't. Seriously. Spend it as if you were quickly prepping a BP round. You've heard the motion, and now you need to just sit there in silence and think about how you're going to approach the opposition case for that round. Just think about it. Have your partner whisper in your ear, write you a note about a specific thing you might want to refute or whatever. Maybe just tune in every now and then to be sure that you're not crazy about it. And yeah, that's what I would say. How do you defend? So spend as much time instructing. Don't listen to the PM speak so much. How do you defend against a tight call? Yes, you actually should just feed all possible arguments. Seriously. Hey guys, so you should respond in the DPM to a tight call so that hopefully the round goes well. And basically you're just like, cool. Sucks that op couldn't think of these arguments. But yeah, I think that's what this debate is about. So you just try to feed some op lines. You don't go here is the full argument that they should have run. You just go hey, here's an op line that could work. And yeah, you just might want to do that. Sometimes speakers try to cite oh, but this was set at Oxford IV in round 4 in 2014, so it's good then. I personally don't like it when speakers do that because, believe it or not, the history of debating has a lot of really racist motions in it. So I find that to be a bad piece of evidence. But yeah, you can absolutely just feed off some lines. Lastly, what I would say in regards to approaching opposition in CP rounds is, how do I say this? Don't buy into the framing that Gov is trying to force on you. Remember an hour ago when I was talking about how on Gov, the first thing you should do from the PM speech is frame the arguments that you think are too good and are likely to beat you as irrelevant? Don't let Gov run away with their framing of the round, right? In a lot of cases, the framing that Gov's trying to do is uncharitable and is likely to try to confuse you or try to push actually strong arguments away from the round. Try to fight back against the framing as much as you can. Because if you can try to explain that the context that Gov wants to have the debate in is untrue and is the wrong context for the round, right? You then force Gov to defend a significant more increase of things that they didn't want to have to defend in the first place. You give yourself a lot more range of arguments that you are able to debate about that you otherwise didn't have the capacity to debate about. So I think that you also improve yourself significantly more by fighting against the framing as early as you can in the LO speech. If anything, I would think that refuting the framing that a PM speaker brings you should probably be the main thing that you are refuting in that speech before you refute any one individual argument that's being made. Yeah, I think that that's about it that I have in regards to op. I guess the last few things are be able to be flexible. In BP, while a lot of you might be always extension speaker and always whip speaker, in CP, you really need to be able to try to find a partner dynamic that is as flexible as possible. Because if you hit a motion that you know nothing about, that your partner knows quite a lot about, but they're not used to first speaking, you might hurt yourself overall. So do try to, in practice, switch quite frequently which speaker position you and your partner hold, so that way you can be as flexible as possible in responding to motions that you don't know about. If you hit a motion that you don't really know all that much about, the two of you, just go back to first principle kind of arguments. Is this legitimate? Will this work? What are the alternatives? Why are those better? What is status quo? Why is that better? Those types of arguments can still reasonably be rather strong in a case that you don't know all that much about. Yeah, I think that's it in regards to my thoughts. I've been talking for, I think, 55 minutes straight or 50 minutes straight, so my voice is hurting a little. I'll take gladly any questions, though, for the rest of this. Okay. Cool. Prep strategy on all. Don't listen to PM. Seriously. Just listen to the motion. Listen to every now and then tune in for like a few seconds to be sure that they're saying things that are relevant and that they're not tricking you and running things in an unexpected way. But like have your partner be on rebuttal duty and try to write that stuff out. And honestly, just try to think of as many arguments as possible. CP is not the same thing as BP. You shouldn't on op have like one or two arguments that are well constructed, link by link by link by link. You're unlikely to find that to be an effective strategy because you just don't have the time to write all of those links. Instead, if you can just try to think of a broad array of arguments and just try to like be much more fluid in how you construct them and building them, as you're up in your speech, you probably have a much better chance of winning because you're forcing Dove to respond to significantly more things and also maybe just can find different actors. The way you think of all this type of stuff though is like trying to break the motion down bit by bit and also maybe just relying on past debates on similar themes as a guiding principle to this, right? So if it's like this house would ban X from Y, right? Why shouldn't it be banned? Why shouldn't there be bans in general? Why should X be involved in Y? All that type of stuff. Yeah, and just like relying on past similar motions and stuff like that might be useful. When prepping cases for Gov, how much work should be put in? That's a good question because I think every team does this differently. I know personally a lot of teams just like take the drive to whatever city you're debating at as the place to prep their cases. I personally think that's bad. I think that instead it just like kind of depends, right? For me and my partner, we do like my partner and I for debating, we live together. So we just kind of talk about them for days and days and days on end. And that ends up going well, but that's not true for most people. So in that regard, it's like, it depends on the motion itself, how much background you have. I would say though, like don't go on like a Wikipedia binge of like reading every single article possible. That's unlikely to be particularly effective. I would just say like be sure that you know the facts that are relevant to the case so that you're not like provably wrong about something important. And yeah, that's really about it. Just like try to think about the op lines, maybe spend an hour or so on a case would really be, I would say, ideal. How do you come up with interesting motions or cases? So I don't. I talk about sports for most of my rounds. I think they're interesting. Many people I've been told do not like talking about what managers should do in specific sporting situations. But to be serious here, I mean, for my meme cases, it's because I'm fundamentally an idiot who likes dumb, lowbrow humor. For other emotions that are like just serious debates and are good, what I would say you should probably do then is just like stick to your interests, right? Like, some very interesting cases that I've heard teams talk about are just like about an article in a specific field that they're interested in, right? A lot of people just write debates about like popular events that have been happening, right? Like honestly, you can have a debate about literally anything, just like try to be sure that there's some amount of arguments on both sides. And if it's about a thing that you think is like, interesting to you, you can frame that in a way that it's a more interesting discussion for those who might not be as well educated on it, right? Like for a lot of my sports rounds, the way I try to make them more interesting is, I try to make it much higher burden on myself. So instead of like arguing for one specific smaller impact that still has a debate on it, but maybe people aren't going to be as interested in, I just kind of like rev it up to 11 and be like, one of them was like, create an international soccer league with all of the best teams in it and just have, an individual league in France lose all of its best teams, right? I just ramped it up to be as insane as possible so that way people can go like, oh, I don't know sports, but that sounds crazy. We can debate that. Don't cite sources. Do not cite sources. People will just think that you're lying. People will not check your sources. And because it's clear that you have out-prepped everyone. Just have generally good, solid points that are based on the sources that you may have read, right? Maybe use them to respond to an inaccurate characterization that the other side is making, but do not cite sources. Any other questions? No, run silly cases. As someone who only runs silly cases in out rounds, run silly cases. In large part because A, you have more fun debates. B, I find that they help your speaker scores. Also, like, I mean, why not do something you find fun? Yeah, run them. Cool. It's exactly like you would do in a BP debate, right? You go, hey, we don't think that Ott was accurate in characterizing this debate. I think instead they've missed out on these particular actors. Let me explain why this is a debate primarily about these groups of people and why it is then that the harms that occur to them are significantly more likely to be the most important in this debate. Yeah, you just do it as you would in any other VP debate. Be charitable to what they said, but just say that it wasn't as important and explain, like, the reason this isn't as important is because the group that we're talking about requires the most amount of help as opposed to a group that's already reasonably privileged in the society that they live in, or something like that. Or our argument is bigger in scope and it affects significantly more people, which is why it is more important than the arguments that you get from Gov. Yeah, that's how you would do it. Anything else? Seeing anything else? I think CP is really fun. I personally use it as a bit of a creative outlet. I know I'd call my own cases boring, but that's because, like, I don't know, I guess I'm more familiar with my own casebook at this point. Don't abolish CP. Actually, depends. Yeah, CP is fun. You can do quite a lot with it. Just like, you know, be prepared. Gov has infinite time, yet loses about 58% of the rounds. Just be well prepared. Think about what the other side is going to say and spend time developing the best responses to it as opposed to just making up the responses as you go. Would be the biggest thing I would take away from this.
So thank you so much, Ethan. Big appreciates for like doing this seminar, especially just before Nats. I think everyone learned a lot. I know I learned a lot. So thanks so much for like being here and doing this. We really appreciate it. If you haven't yet signed up for the practice afterwards, please do. We will likely need judges. So if you are free, please come judge for us. But yeah, so practice should be starting soon, so hop onto the Discord server if you did sign up. If you still want to sign up, you can just shoot me a message, like privately, or in this chat as well. And thanks for coming out, guys. Have a good night.
Thanks, guys.